Welcome to lesson number 12 in our study on the book of Acts. Today we look at Acts 21 verse 15 through Acts 23 verse 22. So let's get right to it. After these days, we got ready and started to go up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came along and brought us to the house of Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple, with whom we were to stay. When we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul went with us to visit James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard it, they praised God. Then they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the law. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe their customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Join these men and go through the rite of purification with them and pay for the shaving of their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself observe and guard the law. But as for the Gentiles who have become believers, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication." Then Paul took them in, and the next day, having purified himself, he entered the temple with them, making public the completion of the days of purification, when the sacrifice would be made for each of them. So where we left it in the last lesson, they were headed back to Jerusalem. They land there in Caesarea, and they stay at the house of Mnason of Cyprus. Cyprus is obviously where he's originally from. That means he's a Hellenistic, probably was a Hellenistic Jew, and would have been there, and he's now living in Caesarea. It's possible he came from a Gentile background, but probably where he was living most likely might have been a Hellenistic Christian. Paul then goes along with the others to see James. Now this James, there are a lot of Jameses mentioned in Scripture. This James is the one who is the brother of Jesus. And scholars disagree and kind of debate back and forth about what role James was playing at this particular time. We see that back at the Council in Jerusalem in chapter 15, James seemed to be kind of the one in greatest authority, kind of the titular head of this burgeoning church. Some believe that he still held this position of authority. Others believe that he might have been kind of a respected figurehead, but maybe these elders mentioned controlled more of and had authority over more what was going on, who was sent out, and those sorts of things. But it is significant that James must have still had some influence, because Luke tells us that they all reported to James. And notice, by the way, since we've had that time that we're still in what we call those we passages, Luke is giving a first-hand account of what's going on right now. So then this interesting conversation takes place. Paul reports what God has done through him and through all the companions. And it says it goes one by one, so he must have given a pretty detailed report, which probably should have taken several hours. James and the others praise God. They praise God for what God has been doing through all of them for the Gentiles. But it's clear that something else is on their mind. It's if they say to Paul, "Paul, we're so happy to hear what God is doing, and we praise God for it. But there still is a problem." The problem is this allegation that came from those who had a Jewish background, who were in that area, that Paul was encouraging the Jews in those Gentile areas, those from Christians who were from a Jewish background, that he was telling them not to observe the law. Even that he was saying don't observe the customs and don't even circumcise your children. Now there's no indication that Paul did this at all. Now certainly we have to remember Paul did not believe that observance to the law was necessary for salvation. and he saw no need for Gentiles to observe the law. But this seems to be a misleading, at best misleading, interpretation of what Paul was saying. And this allegation might have been just an outright, it's possible it was just an outright lie at those who were upset that Paul was going to the Gentiles in the first place. They say, the Gentiles have their own things that they can follow, and the Gentiles are good as long as they follow those restrictions found in that letter sent back in that's recorded in Acts 15. No food sacrificed to idol, no blood, no food that's been strangled, and abstain from fornication. He says, but Paul, the Jewish Christians, those who have that Jewish background, they're still observing the law, and you don't need to tell them not to do that. Again, Paul didn't do that. But that's the charge, probably made by the very same people who had followed Paul from town to town. Remember all that when they go from Thessalonica to Berea and all those different places, that they followed Paul from town to town, making accusations against him, and those accusations weren't true either. Now, there's also the concern then that in Paul doing that, and that Paul maybe in telling others not to observe the law, again, that's a false charge, but in their thinking, and the people who are thinking about this and saying, well, Paul, if you're telling other people not to observe the law, then you must not be observing the law either. And so what happens is that witness that Paul's been making, all those good things that he's recounted one by one about all that God has done among the Gentiles, that really kind of is in danger of whether or not those Jewish Christians would accept those Gentile Christians. And that is a very real concern, because you could have a splintering of the church, but just even in the early decades of the church. Now, part of the thing would be, why would it be that those there in Jerusalem, James and the elders, would believe it in the first place? In fact, they kind of say, well, we aren't saying that we believe it, Paul, but just to be on the safe side, or just to appease these people who are upset, why don't you go through this rite of purification as a demonstration that you observe the law? So they're kind of playing both sides of the fence, if you will. And one saying, well, we're not really sure that you did that, but just to be on the safe side, why don't you go through this rite of purification? Well, who are the ones that are making the allegations? It's not going to be Gentile Christians, is it? It's going to be those very same ones that are making those who've been antagonizing and really, in some measures, stirring up crowds against Paul in the first place. And of course, those that are in Jerusalem, they all come from that Jewish background, so they're probably more inclined to believe those Judaizers, as they're called, from the Gentile areas as well. Those are the ones that would have been sending it in the first place. So you can understand in one respect that concern and them asking Paul about it. But notice, even before Paul has a chance to say and say anything about it, they go, well, we may not believe it, but this is what we want you to do. So do what we tell you to do. And to his credit, Paul does. Even though the facts of the matter show something quite different. Remember, it's Paul who had Timothy to be circumcised, so that Timothy's witness among the Jews, among those Jewish Christians, so that Timothy's witness would not have an excuse to ignore. Paul has observed the law in his own faith journey. And again, he would say over and over and over again that observance of the law is not necessary for salvation. God demonstrated that very definitively in the coming of the Holy Spirit upon those Gentiles that we see recorded in Acts 10. And he argues that point over and over again. But he certainly would not have told those Christians who came from a Jewish background to abandon the observance of the law. He certainly would not have done that. And so it's clear that they were just trying to find something to discredit the witness and the things that Paul had done. So they asked him to go through this rite of purification. Now normally this would take place over the course of about 30 days. We're going to see in a minute that it was more like 7. So Paul takes this Nazirite vow, but he doesn't take it for the full 30 days. And there's a couple of things that go on here. One, there's the shaving of the head, and And don't know, I've never read anything that said the particular haircut that they would have had. But if you've ever seen pictures of monks, and they shave just kind of the top in that round circle, in that circle there on the top of their head, that's called a tonsure. It's a particular way of cutting the hair that identifies them as part of that order, as identifies them as a monk in that full servanthood of God. There would have been a similar type of thing. So whether it was the shaving of the whole head or just a portion, a particular way of shaving the head, we don't know. But that hair then would have been used, because remember Paul did this in a previous time, took that vow. The hair then would have been part of what was offered as a sacrifice in the temple, being a part of who he is. But there's more to that offering and that rite of purification. And we see it found in the book of Numbers. And listen to all the different things that they had to sacrifice as part of this rite of purification. They had the hair, of course, with that. But Numbers 6, 14 and 15 says this. And they shall offer their gift to the Lord, one male lamb a year old without blemish as a burnt offering, one ewe lamb a year old without blemish as a sin offering, one ram without blemish as an offering of well-being, and a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of choice flour mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers spread with oil, with their grain offering and their drink offering. And not only does Paul have to do this, he is asked to pay for the other 4 men that are going through this vow as well. Now, the truth of the matter is that most people in that day and time lived a very subsistence life. They didn't have a lot of cattle. They didn't have a lot of extra animals. Few people had the means to offer a lamb, much less 2 lambs and a ram and all the different grain offerings. And Paul's being asked to provide that not only for himself, but for the 4 other people as well. And so it's almost like they're asking Paul not only to engage in the rite of purification, but to go even beyond that and demonstrate in even greater measure his observance to the law. But notice that Paul did it. And that's the important thing. Because there's a danger that if he'd not gone through this rite of purification, then maybe the Gentiles wouldn't have been accepted by the overall church. They would have seen Paul's witness as damaged or maybe impure or defiled, and so they would see that those Gentile Christians that came to faith under Paul as somehow not being valid or not be acceptable. And so I think what Paul does here is he does it not because he believes he needs to undergo a rite of purification, not because he is saying that he agrees with any of the charges that were made against him. It seems pretty clear that he does this in an act of obedience to the authority of the central church there in Jerusalem. But more so, I would think, to not cause any harm to those Gentile Christians who have come to faith in Jesus Christ. Not to cause any division that would keep people from accepting them. It's actions like this one, I think, that would lead Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 23 to make the following statement. For though I'm free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. So we see here that Paul's willingness to do these sorts of things, not to compromise his faith, but as an act of reconciliation, an act of obedience, an act of care for those early Gentile Christians. And so maybe you think, okay, so he's willing to go through all this, make this great financial sacrifice. That ought to be the end of it. No. Paul's troubles and difficulties are not over. We continue on in verse 27. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, those who had seen him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd. They seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. More than that, he has actually brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For we had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was aroused, and the people rushed together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were trying to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. Immediately he took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. When they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came, arrested him, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. When Paul came to the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowds that followed kept shouting, "Away with him!" Just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" The tribune replied, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. I beg you, let me speak to these people." So let's take a step back and look at what's going on. The Jews in Asia, specifically Ephesus, who had created so much difficulty for him, travel all of that distance to Jerusalem and start to stir up trouble now in Jerusalem. They're not content to do it over in the other areas there in Europe and Asia Minor. They come on over into Jerusalem. They see Paul in the temple. And somehow, because they see Paul in the temple and they see him with this other man, Trophimus, they think, oh, well, Paul must have taken him into the temple and he defiled the temple. And this charge, by the way, is a serious one. It is a one that would be punishable by death to allow a Gentile to enter into the inner part of the temple because it would defile the temple. There was an inscription in doing some archaeological digging. There was an inscription that was discovered that had hung on the wall. There was an outer court that was kind of called the court of the Gentiles, meaning anybody could walk around there. Then there was another court. There were a series of courts leading to the innermost part of the temple. There was another part of the court that was the court of the Jews. And if you were not Jewish, you could not go into that court. And it was so serious that there was a plaque with an inscription on there that said, any Gentile who goes beyond these walls will be responsible for his death that will ensue. That's how serious it was. And so they think, well, Paul has defiled the temple, and they are going to kill him over that as what they see as just punishment for bringing somebody in the temple, when in actuality, nobody ever actually could have seen Paul bring him into the temple because Paul didn't do so. It shows how serious it is and what they intend to do. Not only do they intend to kill him, but it also says that the gates were closed. And that's because in that part of the temple, no human blood could be spilled. And so they're closing the gates to make sure no stray blood gets in there. This is an idea of how serious this is. They're getting ready, they truly are getting ready to kill Paul. But a member of the Roman army hears things going on. He hears things getting stirred up. They take Paul out of that, and they do arrest him. Now, whether they arrested him just to make it easier to get him out of there, or whether they believed he was this man who had brought a revolt against Rome, we don't know. Maybe they thought all of those things. But they arrest him to get him out of the way. Now, the other thing is that they think not only are they responding to this disturbance that's made because of this false accusation that he's defiled the temple, they also think he might be this Egyptian man who had gone with 4,000 assassins trying to revolt against the Roman Empire. So they just said, things are so chaotic, people are shouting things here and there, things are so chaotic, we're going to get Paul out of that situation. And it says they take him into the barracks. But it's an interesting thing that where they take him is the Antonia Fortress. And the Antonia Fortress is where they had taken Jesus when he went before Pilate. Now I want to take I want to go back to what happens when they arrest Paul. They take him over to that area. Remember, the crowds are shouting, "Away with him!" They're shouting, "Away with him!" I don't think Luke is meaning to equate Paul with Christ. I think he's doing it more relating to the crowd. But do you remember that when Jesus goes before Pilate, he's there in the Antonia fortress. He is having to give a defense before Roman officials, and it is the Jewish people under the stirring up of the leaders. It is the crowd that is saying, "Away with him, crucify him." They don't use the word crucify here, but they're saying the same type of thing. The same type of people are doing that. I just have to think that Luke did not do this as a coincidence. I think he's trying to draw parallels, not necessarily between Paul and Christ in terms of equating them in any way, but he's trying to draw parallels in terms of the reaction of the crowd, their inability to listen, and the dangers of that mob mentality. So Paul says, "Can I speak?" And when he does this tribune realizes that Paul knows Greek, because Paul obviously says it to him in Greek. And it's clear then that he says, "Oh, well, you're not this other guy that we've been looking for." And Paul says, "No." And basically he says, "I think I can get control if you'll just allow me to speak." And so they allow him. And I'm going to read just a few verses here, and then I'm going to skip down. Verse 40, when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the people for silence. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying. Now, I'm not going to read all of the next few verses. I'm actually going to skip all the way down to chapter 22, verse 17. But basically what happens in these intervening verses is that Paul recounts what we know already, especially if you've been going through all of the lessons in this study, is Paul recounts his life before Christ, Christ calling him on the road to Damascus, all that he had done up to that point, his persecution of the church, his coming to faith in Jesus Christ, and God using him to go now and make a strong defense of the gospel. And in verse 17 of chapter 22, in verse 17, Paul does give a little bit of a piece of information that we have not had before about when he is up in Jerusalem. And this is what he says as part of that witness. After I'd returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Jesus saying to me, "Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." And I said, "Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your witness Stephen was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him." Then Jesus said to me, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." So even though Barnabas, remember when he goes up to Jerusalem, Barnabas accepts him, there's still this period of time in which it's still not really clear. They're still not really clear or not really sure that they can trust Paul and who he is. And so Jesus says, when he gets there, he says, "This is the call that I have for you, not to be a primary witness to the Jewish people, but to go to those Gentiles and proclaim my name and the resurrection of the dead." And so, Paul, that's a little bit of a more detailed information than we have had before. And so Paul kind of talks about what's going on, and then in verse 22, we see the crowd get in an uproar again. Up to this point, they listened to him, but then they shouted, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the tribune directed that he be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging to find out the reason for the outcry against him. But when they had tied him up with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who's uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen." The tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune said, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen. Immediately, those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Since he wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and had him stand before him. So why is it that the crowd just kind of goes haywire along these lines? It's because he says, Jesus told me to go to the Gentiles. Remember, these are people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But they are still strictly observing the law. And so when they hear that, these are people who just can't accept that God has a plan of salvation for the Gentiles as well. They never really fully accepted that. And so when Paul says, and so they could have easily deluded themselves into thinking, well, Paul's just kind of going off on his own, and they don't really understand everything that he's been doing and going to these Gentiles and going outside of what he's supposed to do. No, Paul is saying, I had a vision and the Lord himself told me to go bear witness to the Gentiles. At this point, they just kind of lose their minds. They take off their cloaks, they throw them in the air, they throw dust up in the air. They're just really going haywire and about to get back to that being that uncontrolled mob. The Romans don't understand what all the uproar is about. They could really care less about the internal goings on and disputes among these people of the Jewish faith, because they all saw them as Jews. They really didn't see any difference between Jews and Christians, but they do want to avoid a riot. So they take Paul, after Paul's kind of stood up and spoken, they take him back there into the barracks, and they're going to conduct an investigation. And they decide, just for kind of good measure, just to loosen him up a little bit, they're going to flog him. The thing about it is, it's clear, though, that this is a major no-no. The reason being that Paul is a Roman citizen, and there's no way that they think that Paul actually is a Roman citizen. Probably never even entered their minds, because he would have been dressed like a Hebrew. We know he was trained as a Pharisee, all those sorts of things. So they probably thought there was no chance that Paul would have ever been a Roman citizen. And it's much less to be born one. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And so Paul makes to the centurion, he says, and Paul knows the law, by the way, so he's like, hey, is it really legal to bound and flog somebody who's a Roman citizen? Knowing full well that it's not. At that point, the centurion gets a little spooked, and he goes over to the tribune, and he says, hey, this man says he's a Roman citizen, and we've just bound him and beat him. The tribune goes over and says, hey, are you a Roman citizen? And he says, yes. And the tribune assumes that he must have done what he had done, which was, he just assumes that Paul must have bought his citizenship, but may have been trying to figure out how he bought his citizenship. So basically he just says, well, I had to buy my citizenship, and it cost me an awful lot of money. And it's kind of almost saying, you don't look like you have that type of money to throw around. And then Paul gives the clincher, but I was born a citizen. At that point, the people that are around him draw back. It's because in that moment, they have gone from being in charge of the situation to not knowing what's going to happen, because all of them could be liable for their role in allowing a Roman citizen who had not gone on trial to be bound and to be beaten. So, the tribune basically says, this may really actually be a religious matter. So then he calls the Sanhedrin, those who are Jews, not Jewish Christians, those who are Jews, those leading Jewish authorities, and he says, why don't y'all work it out in the midst of that? He's trying to get Paul out of the way as quick as he can, because he knows if Paul decides to pitch a fit about it, he could be in real trouble. And so then Paul, beginning in chapter 23, verse 1, Paul then makes now, after making his defense there, he makes his defense now before these leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And we pick up there. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, brothers, up unto this day I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God. Then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. At this, Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck? Those standing nearby said, do you dare to insult God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not realize, brothers, that he was a high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people. When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, Brother, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I'm on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees say that there's no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group stood up and contended, we found nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks. That night the Lord spoke to him and said, keep up your courage. For just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness in Rome. In the morning, the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves to an oath to neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who joined in this conspiracy. Then they went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the council must notify the tribune to bring him down to you on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination of his case. And we are ready to do away with him before he arrives. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him. So we took him, brought him to the tribune, and said, the prisoner Paul called and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you. The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and said, what is it that you have to report to me? The young man answered, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully into his case. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him. They have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. They are ready now and are waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, tell no one that you have informed me of this. Now this interchange is full of great exchanges and intrigues. And it's right off the bat. Paul makes one sentence, brothers, I stand before you with a clear conscience. And then Ananias, the high priest, orders Paul to be struck. So why is it that he makes such a strong response? Because of one simple statement. Well, there are a couple of possibilities. The first is that Paul begins by saying brothers, and he identifies as a Pharisee, as a son, or is about to identify as a Pharisee and a son of Pharisees. And so, but he's identifying with them, brothers, like we are part of the same fold. That may have been offensive because these folks probably saw Paul as heretical. And he certainly wouldn't have been like them because if nothing else, then he believed Christ had been raised, was the Son of God, was the Messiah, and been raised from the dead. Maybe they find that offensive. But the other is a possibility that I ran across, that the term a clear conscience was more of a phrase used related to Greek philosophy than we find than in Jewish thought. So they might have thought that in standing before them that he was insulting them by using this Gentile phrase. We don't really know, but it's clear that they took offense at what he had to say. And then Paul gives a very quick and harsh response and rebuke, actually, to this high priest. He cites these biblical eulogies. He says, you are a whitewashed wall. And that they certainly would have understood what they meant, because calling Ananias the high priest a whitewashed wall is an allusion to Ezekiel chapter 13, verse 10. And in Ezekiel 13:10, God is speaking through Ezekiel to provide a harsh critique and warning to people who are false prophets of the day. And part of what he says is, you are false prophets. You build a weak wall of prophecy, and then you try to hide it with a veneer of whitewash. In other words, you have no substance. There's nothing really to what you're trying to say, but you dress it up as being bright and shiny to impress those people who don't know. And so to call him the high priest of whitewashed wall is very audacious and very kind of brave in its own way. And they would have understood. He's saying to the high priest, you are like a false prophet. So then they rebuke Paul. And they say, who are you to talk to God's high priest like this man who's in great authority? At which point Paul seemingly, and I emphasize the word seemingly, offers an apology. And the reason I say it's seemingly, because there are a couple of things with this. When Paul says, forgive me, I didn't recognize who you were. Paul knew exactly who the high priest was. This wasn't a man unknown to him. He would have known who he was, and the high priest as he would have entered into, and it would have been made very clear that this was God's high priest. He had a place to be. He's running the show. Paul knows exactly who this high priest is. It's like one of us saying, well, forgive me, I didn't know that you were the president. We know who the president is. Everybody knows who the high priest is. So why does he say this? Why does he say, forgive me, I didn't recognize you? I tend to agree with the thought that I read in a variety of places, that what Paul is doing is kind of giving that passive-aggressive backhand verbal slap to the high priest. Basically saying, oh, forgive me. You mean you're the high priest? Because you sure don't seem to be acting and responding like I would expect a high priest to act. So I didn't recognize you for who you were. He's really kind of, I think it's accurate, I think he's kind of being sarcastic towards that high priest. And then after that, but he kind of seemingly apologizes. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do this. I know you're not supposed to speak bad of your elders and whatnot. And then Paul says, okay, now he launches into his defense. But he doesn't get far into his defense before things break apart again. And that is, he says, I'm on trial because of my belief in the hope of the resurrection of the dead. And immediately, those members of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, start getting in an argument. Because as Luke says, Pharisees believe that they're in angels, and spirits, and they believe in an afterlife and resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees didn't believe in any of them. They believed when you died, that you died. You observed the law in faithfulness and witness to God while on this earth, and when you died, you died. And some scholars I read, commentaries I read, said they think Paul does this as a clever ploy just to pull everything into chaos, cause all sorts of chaos. I really don't think that's why he did it. I tend to think because he's willing at other times to make a strong defense of the gospel. And he has an opportunity right here and now to go before the very Sanhedrin themselves and make a defense of the gospel. I tend to go more along the lines of the thought that, of course, he's there to speak about the hope of the resurrection of the dead because he is a follower of Jesus Christ. You cannot speak about who Christ is without emphasizing that Christ was killed, on the third day rose again, ascended into heaven, and sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. Of course he has to talk about the resurrection of the dead because our whole faith hinges on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The effect, however, is that it splits the group. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, bind themselves, and almost certainly it was all Sadducees, these 40 people who bound themselves in an oath. They're so upset, they just end up binding themselves in an oath. The Pharisees go, who knows? Maybe a spirit or an angel spoke to him. Who are we to say? We think he needs to be released. We then have what happens is that those 40 people, like I said, almost certainly all Sadducees, those 40 people bound themselves in an oath, they're not going to eat or drink. Paul's nephew finds out about it, goes and tells Paul. Paul tells the centurion, who tells the tribune, on and on and on. And so, in the midst of this, you see, we have them trying to figure out, okay, how can we gain control of this situation and keep this man from being killed, especially while he's in our care. And so they said, well, what we're going to do then is we're just going to send you on to another group. We're just going to send you on to a man named Felix, who's a governor, and that's going to take place in Caesarea. It's a good way to for Claudius Lysias to try to curry favor with Felix. It's also a way to get rid of the situation and to kind of pass the buck once again, as people have been doing, and to get him out of the way. Lesson 13 picks up with Paul on the move to the Roman court in Caesarea under the charge of a governor by the name of Felix. So that's where we will pick up with the next lesson. 2 lessons left in our time together. Thank you for taking the time today. I hope that it has been something that you've learned, and what we see in here is the faithfulness of Paul. And in the larger picture, before I was getting ready to conclude, let me give one other final point that I forgot to include. Is that in the midst of all these machinations, all these things going on, and all the details, which I think are interesting, we can't lose sight of the larger picture. The larger picture is that Paul has been wanting to get to Rome, but God says, basically has said, now the time is not right. Now the time has come for Paul to get to Rome. And what we see in the next lesson as well, is all the things that start falling into place. All these things that have been going on beforehand that are coming to a culmination now that start falling into place. And the end result is that Paul will get to Rome. But man, there's quite a journey before he gets there. So we'll pick up with next week where we left off today. Thank you again for joining me today. I hope you have a blessed day in the Lord.